You haven't spoken today, not out loud, you've typed, you've tapped, you've sent a thumbs up to a message you didn't even bother reading all the way through, but you haven't opened your mouth and let an actual word out into the air. And the strange part is, you probably didn't notice. A whole day can slide by like that now, filled and busy and loud in every way, except the one that used to define being human. So here's the question worth sitting with for a moment. What happens if that day stretches into a year? Not a year of total silence. You'd still hear the world around you, traffic outside your window, a television left on in another room, strangers' conversations drifting past you on the street. But a year where you never speak to another person and no other person speaks to you. No phone calls, no texts that count as talking, no small exchange with the cashier, no "how's it going" tossed across a hallway. Just you, alone in the space where language used to happen. The first few days would feel almost like relief. If you've ever taken a solo trip or spent a weekend somewhere quiet with your phone switched off, you already know that first wave of stillness. Your nervous system, which has spent years absorbing a constant low hum of other people's voices, finally gets to settle. Researchers who study attention and stress have found that extended, unstructured silence lowers activity in the parts of the brain responsible for processing social threat. The same circuitry that quietly works overtime anytime you're in a room with other people, even when you don't consciously feel it. So at first, your body would relax in a way it hasn't in years, but somewhere around the second or third week, something else begins. You start talking to yourself, not out of madness, but out of necessity. Language doesn't only exist to be sent to other people, it's also how your brain organizes thought. Take away its usual outlet, and the pressure has to go somewhere. In 1962, a French geologist named Michel Seyffer spent 2 months living alone in a cave, cut off from clocks, sunlight, and other human voices, to study how isolation would affect his mind. He began narrating his own movements out loud within days. He started talking to objects. It wasn't a breakdown. It was a mind refusing to let its own wiring go quiet. Time itself would start behaving strangely too. Without the small, verbal check-ins that usually anchor your days, a quick good morning, a passing comment about the weather, a coworker mentioning it's already Thursday, your internal clock would begin drifting. Seyffer noticed this in his cave. By the time he emerged, believing only about a month had passed, more than 2 months had actually gone by. His mind, starved of the social markers that normally keep time feeling structured, had simply lost the thread. In a year of silence, entire weeks would likely blur into each other the same way, distinct only by whatever small rituals you managed to invent to replace the ones language used to provide. By the second month, the loneliness stops being just an emotion and starts becoming something closer to a physical state. Researchers who study chronic social isolation have long observed that it raises cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone, in a pattern that looks strikingly similar to the body's response to physical danger. Your brain, shaped over hundreds of thousands of years to treat separation from the group as a survival threat, doesn't know the difference between being cut off from your tribe on an open plain and being cut off from your friends by a year of silence. It reacts the same way either way. Elevated heart rate, disrupted sleep, a restlessness with no obvious source. Somewhere around month 3, your voice itself would start to change. Speech is a skill, and like any skill, it degrades without practice. Your vocal cords are muscles, and without regular use, they lose flexibility and strength, exactly the way any other unused muscle would. People recovering from long medical silences, like extended time on a ventilator, often describe their first words back as feeling foreign in their own mouths, rough, uncertain, slower to form than they should be. A year of disuse would leave your voice thinner, and the muscle memory behind quick, fluent sentences would start to fade. It isn't only your voice that erodes either. Your ability to read other people starts slipping too. So much of human communication isn't the words at all. It's the timing, the tone, the micro-expressions that flicker across a face in a fraction of a second. That's a skill sharpened only through constant practice, the same way a musician's ear sharpens only through constant listening. Take that practice away for a year, and when you finally sit across from another person again, you might miss sarcasm, misread a joke as an insult, or feel a half second behind in every exchange, like you're translating a language you used to speak fluently. Even finding the right word could become a small, humbling struggle. Linguists call this word-finding difficulty, and it's the same stumble you sometimes feel after waking from a deep sleep, reaching for an ordinary word and coming up empty for a beat too long. After a year without conversation to keep that retrieval system exercise, that beat of hesitation could show up in almost every sentence you try to speak. Around the halfway mark, something more unsettling can surface. In extreme isolation studies, and in real accounts from solitary confinement, prolonged sensory and social deprivation has been linked to hallucinations. Not only visual ones, but auditory ones too. People report hearing voices that aren't there, sometimes familiar, sometimes not. Some neuroscientists believe this happens because the brain's social circuitry doesn't tolerate being unused. Deprived of real input, it starts generating its own, filling the silence the same way your eyes generate phantom shapes in a pitch-black room. Your brain, in other words, does not take well to being ignored for that long. Your dreams would start working overtime to compensate. People who've endured long stretches of isolation, from expedition scientists to shipwrecked sailors, consistently report unusually vivid, socially crowded dreams, full of conversations, crowded rooms, familiar faces talking over one another. It's as if the part of your brain built for connection, denied its usual supply during the day, goes looking for it the moment you fall asleep. Waking up from a dream like that, into a day with no one to tell it to, is something more than one isolated person has described as its own quiet kind of heartbreak. There's also a slower, quieter shift, one that's harder to notice from the inside. People who've spent long periods alone, from polar researchers to long-term hermits, describe something scientists sometimes call emotional flattening. Not sadness exactly, but a kind of muting, where big feelings, both good and bad, start arriving smaller than they used to. Part of this is protective. A mind that's been alone for months learns to stop reaching for connection it can't get, the same way a muscle you stop using slowly stops firing on its own. But it also means that somewhere in that year, joy would start to feel a little further away too. Many people in this position start writing instead, and it isn't a coincidence. Diaries, letters never sent, long notes typed and deleted, all of it becomes a pressure valve for a mind that still has things to say and nowhere to say them out loud. Isolated researchers and long-term solo sailors have described their logbooks becoming less like records and more like conversation partners, something to argue with, confide in, even apologize to. Writing can't fully replace a voice, but it turns out to be the closest substitute the mind can find on its own. Then, if the year finally ended and you were handed a real conversation again, something dramatic would happen. Your body wouldn't just adjust, it would react. Human touch and conversation trigger a release of oxytocin, sometimes nicknamed the bonding hormone, and after a year of near-total absence, that first real exchange, a hug, a genuine conversation, even sustained eye contact, could land with an intensity that feels almost overwhelming. People returning from extreme solitude often describe this rebound as something close to sensory overload, colors sharper, voices louder, emotions unexpectedly close to the surface, ready to spill at the smallest provocation. That overload wouldn't fade in a day either. People returning from long isolation often describe weeks of feeling slightly out of step in conversation, talking too long without noticing, standing too close, or going quiet at moments where a response was expected. Small glitches in a rhythm that used to be automatic. Conversation, it turns out, isn't just a skill you either have or don't. It's more like a muscle memory built from thousands of tiny repetitions, knowing when to nod, when to interrupt, when to let a silence sit. A year without practice wouldn't erase that memory completely, but it would leave you relearning its timing almost from scratch. It's worth saying that not everyone breaks the same way in a scenario like this, and not everyone breaks at all. Monks who take vows of long-term silence often describe the experience as expansive rather than corrosive, a kind of mental clarity that only arrives once the constant noise of social performance is stripped away. The difference seems to lie in whether the isolation is chosen or imposed. A year of silence you walk into on purpose, with meaning attached to it, activates the mind very differently than a year of silence forced on you by circumstance. The body, it turns out, can tell the difference between solitude and abandonment, even when the outward conditions look identical, which might be the real discovery hiding inside this entire thought experiment. You don't actually need people around you constantly to stay well. What you need is the knowledge that connection is available to you, that the silence you're in is a choice and not a sentence. Take that reassurance away. Stretch the silence out for a full year with no one on the other end of it, and the human mind, so capable of enduring almost anything, starts to fray at exactly the point you'd least expect. Not because of the silence itself, but because of what the silence starts to mean. So the next time an entire day passes and you realize you haven't spoken a single word out loud, it's worth pausing on that for a second, not out of alarm but out of appreciation. Somewhere underneath the texting and the tapping and the thumbs up you never meant to send, there's a mind that still needs the sound of another voice more than it lets on. You still haven't said a word today, not out loud, but now, at least, you know exactly what that silence has been asking of you all along.